So this afternoon, we are going to crack straight on with a presentation, The Art of Distributed Work, Harnessing Strengths and Mitigating Weaknesses for Asynchronous Success. Please welcome to the stage Gonçalo Silva, who's the CTO at Doist. Thank you, Gonçalo.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. So distributed work is everywhere nowadays, and where it isn't, there is a potential for it. In fact, I think that as leaders in our organizations, we have a duty to our teams and to the people we manage to understand this tool, to know how to use it, when to use it, and how to make the most of it. In fact, this morning I was looking at the compensation survey results from CTO Craft. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but I was shocked by the 98% of people who are working in either a remote or a hybrid environment, and actually would love to do a show of hands. How many of you are leading, directly or indirectly, fully distributed teams? All right, that's a lot. And hybrid teams? That's a lot too. Okay, I think this is going to be an interesting talk for this crowd. So here's a URL. You can use this to follow along as I speak, or you can use this to revisit later. And if you're wondering whether I added this QR code last night in a hurry because everyone else had it, you are right. All right, so I think the value of distributed work it's pretty much beaten to death. We were all forced into it, whether we wanted it or not. But I would find it a bit hard to talk about it without talking about the data very, very briefly. I'm sure you're all aware of this survey that Buffer does every year with thousands and thousands of remote workers. And this kind of tells you why you should care about this topic. The vast majority of people who work remotely want to continue working remotely. The vast majority of people recommend it to others. The vast majority of people are extremely fulfilled by it. So who am I? This is definitely not like the same way of working as usual, and the challenges are very different. That's why we're all here today. So who am I? You probably haven't heard much about me because I'm not very active on social media, but where I am, you will find me on that handle. And the reason I am talking about these topics is mostly because I've been doing it across many kinds of roles, across many years, basically. For over 15 years, I've done some variation of remote or asynchronous work, 11 of those at Doist, across all of the roles you see there, and the last 6 as CTO. And what about Doist? Maybe you haven't heard about this. Doist is the fully distributed and bootstrapped company behind Todoist, the personal productivity and task manager app, Twist, the team communication app, and we are pretty much 109 people collaborating over 34 countries, and we've been doing this forever, basically. So let's talk about the structure of this talk as we go in. So this presentation is a little dense. I will move quickly. I have a lot of slides. But I do have checkpoints along the way where you can pick back up if you get lost. And there are 3 parts to this structure. We're going to look at history first. We're going to go back in time and see what history can teach us about distributed work. We don't have to reinvent the wheel and rediscover everything from the ground up. We're also going to talk about what we have learned at Doist. So this section is more about anecdotes and more about advice of things we have been intentionally fine-tuning over the last 15 years to make the most of this. And we're going to end with what everyone is here for, basically a blueprint, so a succinct list of key ideas and actions we should at least consider to make distributed work work. So let's start from the beginning. And when I say the beginning, I mean the very beginning, because distributed work, it's older and more ubiquitous than our intuition may tell us. I mean, we can look at one of the oldest institutions in the world to start seeing how old this kind of work dates back. If you think about it, the Catholic Church has been fully distributed from its beginning. It has done most of its work asynchronously, especially before the telephone or even the internet, where most communication and most alignment was done via documentation in books, in letters, carried by people, by emissaries. And when I say asynchronous, I mean asynchronous. I mean, up until the 18th century, and that may seem like a long time ago, but that's most of the church's existence, it took 38 days to cross the Atlantic. That's how long it took to get a message across the ocean. So what kind of insights can we take from how it's been operating and working until now? Well, first and foremost, how important having extensive documentation is. And when I mean documentation, written documentation, I don't mean of specific things. I mean of everything, of values, of strategy, of events, of ideas, of directions, everything really. Another insight besides thorough documentation is about having clear roles. Because, at a distance, implicit relationships, implicit roles, and heroic efforts are really not reliable, so expectations need to be well established from the get-go. One insight that I personally find very interesting is this concept of balancing ambiguity with, the lack thereof. You see, the church has been able to have a high-level shared understanding of how it operated, but then allowing for local discretion. Because at a distance, it is very, very hard, if not impossible, to have perfect alignment and perfect consolidation. So you want to align on the fundamentals, on the core principles of what you're doing and how you're doing it and your identity. But it's not just distributed work that is older and more ubiquitous than our intuition may tell us. Telecommuting is exactly the same thing. I mean, you can look back to the Middle Ages where creative work flourished, despite many things being very questionable about these times. You had blacksmiths, carpenters, brewers, potters, all working from home, using their own tools, at their own pace, usually with a clear goal of something to build or something to fix, mostly uninterrupted, at their own time. And here, too, we have a bunch of interesting insights. The first one is about uninterrupted time, because creative work, and most of the work our teams do is creative, flourishes when there is time for focused work and deep work consistently, and it falters when there are constant interruptions and distractions. Another insight besides clear goals, besides deep focus, is clear goals, because ultimately, these people in the Middle Ages, they knew what they were building, they knew what they were fixing, and this helped them stay on track, stay focused, stay on the task. So there was no ambiguity about what was happening. We can extend this, travel back in the past to the Renaissance, but honestly, most of the takeaways are exactly the same. People worked in a very similar manner. The difference is there was economic development up until now, and besides building, many of these people were also selling. So they had street-facing shops to sell what they built. And this is also an interesting takeaway from these times, because there was a very deliberate and planned for context switching. First, they built, then they sold. Now, we're all about building amazing products here in corporations, so this history lesson may be more or less interesting depending on where you're coming from. So let's talk about a company, and let's talk about this company, the Hudson Bay Company. If you're not aware of what this company is, it is the largest continually operating company in North America and Canada's largest retailer. It's been in operation for over 300 years to this day, and it is highly distributed. It's based in London, but most of its operations were in Canada, especially in the beginning. And this company was a big focus of this book, Distributed Work, by researchers at MIT, which did over the book exactly what I'm trying to do with you today, which is look back and analyze of what are the kind of weaknesses and strengths of distributed work. And half of the book is dedicated just to this company. If you read the book, you're going to find a bunch of insights, but these, I think, are the most interesting or the most prominent, the most obvious. And the first one is something we have discussed today. The HBC had very clear roles from the beginning. Their org chart is beautiful. It looks like an inverted tree. There's a lot of definition, no ambiguity at all. It had, for example, a clear leader per port, and they had hundreds of ports. Another one is explicit information. So the HBC had extensive documentation on the ins and outs of the company, the values, how they operated, procedures, down to the most granular detail you can imagine. Another one that I want to mention is internal branding. Now, this is kind of an interesting one, but I found it interesting in the book how they described that the HBC would take most of their employees from London to Canada. Again, this would take a long time. We talked about this too. And they used this trip to indoctrinate new people into the values and the way of thinking and working of the company. It was a very intense moment on the boat for over a month. They did something else which was very interesting to promote this consistent and consolidated way of thinking, which was favoring internal promotions over external hires. The HBC also took advantage of basically detailed record keeping, and this will be very important in just a second, because they basically took records of everything they did. Decisions, procedures, executions, everything. Which altogether, this puzzle leads to what I think is the most interesting insight from how the HPC operated and what the book calls the foundation of their management philosophy, which is trust and control. Now, I find this interesting because usually trust and control are in friction, in a way. But HPC actually argues that you need both, and you need both at the right places to make things work in a fully distributed manner. Basically, the key idea, not to oversimplify, but it is trust but verify and correct. So the idea here being they had strong internal branding, extensive documentation on how to think and how to do things, and then they gave people a ton of autonomy to do them and to make decisions. Those people took decisions, made whatever they needed to make, and they kept records of their decision-making and their actions. And then their managers would review those records and provide feedback as needed. So they used this to maintain high trust, high velocity, without having this oversight in the way. I feel like we can't talk about distributed works, distributed teams, without talking about the Linux kernel. It's definitely one of the biggest distributed software projects in existence. I mean, it powers most servers out there, most of the public cloud where all of our services run, most smartphones in the world, lots of IoT-type devices, lots of stuff in space too. We're talking about a project that has over 30 years of distributed development, millions and millions of lines of code, dozens of thousands of contributors over this time, and even active. Today, there are over 1,000 contributors in this project. I find this project fascinating, how this can even work and exist, and I think one thing definitely is very strong in opinionated leadership that contributes, because that gets a lot of stuff on this list. There is a very clear vision from the project. There has always been. There are very clear roles. And about roles, everybody in this room knows what Conway's law is. And it's very interesting to see how the people working on Linux organize around the kernel modules. And that's a way to make things independent, asynchronous, and very efficient. And clear responsibilities. Something that's rather new about Linux, that's new about modern times, is that they actually have good tools, which is not something that the other examples can really speak to. They have modern tools like email, they have modern tools like version control, not to mention the internet and computers themselves. Linux also gives us another insight into collaboration, one we've seen before but slightly different, which is the immense focus they put on peer reviews. You see, peer reviews are the main way the Linux kernel ensures a high bar for quality. It's also a main way that they ensure people are getting enough mentoring. And this is going to be important, again, for fully distributed teams. So it's time to wrap up this section. I hope everybody's awake, still awake. But the truth is that history is filled with insights that we can learn from, and also red threads. No matter where you look, I gave you 4 very different examples, and you noticed how there were many overlapping lessons. All of these, in fact, appear in more than one case. So let's talk about our learnings at Doist. What have we been doing, fine-tuning and learning along the way? So this is a little bit less analytical, and it's more about stories that I'm going to tell you and learnings we've had from those stories. Starting with skin in the game. This may sound ridiculous to many people in the audience, but this is probably our very first lesson. Our founder, Amir, wanted to originally create a company of freelancers. He wanted to create a massive tech company where there were no employees. He was basically the only person. So we started hiring freelancers across the world. You can see how this leads to the company layout today. And obviously, he quickly realized this didn't work, because even though many of those freelancers ended up being Doist's founding team, in many, many roles, we had a lot of churn and a lot of rotation and a lot of frustration because the incentives weren't aligned. There was a gap to be filled. And this gap obviously starts with proper setup, having proper employees with proper benefits, and extending this later to higher level incentives like stock options, and aligning bonuses to performance, not only individual performance, but also company performance. How well are we doing as a collective? So this was the first learning. Another learning, which I think may be useful to many people in the audience today, is that hybrid is distributed work in hard mode. If you want to play the hard game, do hybrid. And we learned this accidentally because, again, we started off, first 5 employees, and we had 5 countries. That's the beginning of the company. But as you know, in the beginning of a team, of a company, usually you hire from people's network. And we ended up with about a third, up until we were 20 people, roughly, we ended up with about a third of the company in one city, in Porto. And people, this was not planned for. They organically got together, let's rent an office, let's work together, be there together. It was so great that the founder even flew from Chile to Porto to hang out with these people. And suddenly, we started having these conversations every month, every 2 months, about how random but important brainstorms were happening, and not everybody was in the loop. Worse, how these informal decisions were happening, and even though they made sense, and they were logical, and they were correct, not the right people were in the loop. So we actually took it apart, slowly over time. We don't have an office today, even though we have more people in Porto, because, and this is why I mentioned it's doing distributed work in hard mode, we lost the incentive, the forcing function to make things work. And how to make things work? Well, number one is one we've seen throughout history, documentation. Being documentation in everything we do. So I think this is critical because it's the foundation of all the other advice in this talk. And when I talk about documentation, I mean things like the handbook. We've had there's a very famous handbook, I hope all of you know, it's amazing, from GitLab. We've had a very similar thing internally. We never published it, but it's the same idea. We document everything, and we take the time to keep it up to date. And we're talking about documents that are evergreen, but not only. We document company values. We document the company's mission. We document long-term strategy and short-term roadmaps, processes, decisions, how decisions are made and why, outcomes. Almost everything you can think of, we dump there, and then we use it and reuse it to make decisions and be informed. Now, documentation does not end with the handbook. Also, the way we communicate internally moved on from chat-like small messages to long-form text. And why this matters is that 90% of our conversations are, there's a lot of thought process behind them. They're long, they're engaging, there's a lot of signal. They're also highly searchable. It's very easy to find discussions we've had before, which was something we were struggling with before. Another one are meetings. So we also approach meetings, which we have very few of, but we approach it with a documentation-first mindset. So we don't go into every single meeting with a predefined agenda of the topics we're going to discuss. It's never on the spot. And we go further. Every meeting has actions, and actions have dates and responsible people for following up on those actions. So yes, I hope these are just some examples, but I hope it illustrates how we approach documentation. It's about everything we do, all of the time, no exceptions. Again, this is one of the things that sometimes we didn't do when we were hybrid and in office. The next one is another one we've seen as well from HPC in this case. It's the strong internal branding, which for us means being completely intentional about who we are in the world, who we want to be, and where do we want to be in a few years. Our identity and our culture. That starts with our core values, just like many of you. We also have ours. But one interesting thing, and we also talked about this yesterday, was that when we originally defined them, we'd had 12, and we were happy and amazing. These 12 core values really represent who we are in the world, until we learned that not everybody actually knew the list of core values. And I mean, why would they? There are 12, and often they were in conflicts. So we cut that down. We cut that down to 5. We boiled it down to the essentials because we felt like really we need something that everybody knows immediately. It needs to be something easy. It needs to be something clear and ambiguous. But actually, we cut it down further. Because out of the 5, there was one of them who was often in conflict with the others. And if it's in conflict, it's not building clarity. And if it's not building clarity, it's not doing its job. So I'll explain later which one we cut, but we're down to 4. And now everybody knows them by heart because that is something we can keep in mind very easily. Now, these core values, we don't just use them on the day-to-day of the company. We use them when hiring. Actually, we look deeper into these core values than even hard skills or functional skills, however you want to call them. Because all of the skills are important, but we've found that for long-term success, these are the most important. These lead to better impact over a longer term. And not just hiring and then onboarding. During onboarding, we have an explicit mentor for each person that joins. We have a project with specific tasks and resources for them to read and explore. Again, it's very similar to the HPC in their indoctrination process, like embedding people in our culture in a very intense way. You see, fully distributed teams have very little room for micromanagement or oversight. It's a fool's errand. It doesn't really work. And when you have explicit guidelines, explicit values that guide behaviors and expectations, and you make them very clear, it is easier to get everybody aligned on how we should be operating. Another point I want to mention, which I think is important for fully distributed teams, is performance, because I really feel that remote work has somewhere along the line got a bad reputation for around this topic. And I can see why. Like, it's been associated with a relaxed environment, and all of these traits that may not be conducive to basically building amazing things. And I do think we need to take this in a very intentional way, because high performance is actually very healthy, very good when done in a healthy way. We are huge fans of this quote at Doist by James Clear. I'm not sure if you've seen it before. And here's the anecdote I wanted to tell you before. So one of our 5 core values was balance, and it was balance in the way it is framed here specifically. The problem is, over time, and as more people heard about this value, you kind of like lose the way there, and you just end up with the word balance, until we realized that internally and externally, the perception was more about being relaxed and ambitious, and all of the things that we weren't really looking for. This is what we were looking for. The truth is that high performance requires balance. It requires sustainability. It requires resting and disconnecting. But it also requires intensity at work and having a good competency fit for the job. So I really think for fully distributed teams, it is important to build a culture that is supportive of all of these sustainable manners, but also is very clear about, we're trying to do great things, basically, and great things take work. That starts with clear expectations. What are we doing? What are our goals? If that isn't clear, nothing else is clear. And it also goes through consistency. So we all know, the ups and downs of work. Working through measures and ways of working that get your team delivering consistency is also key. You see, when you think about high performance, you may think about, you have some high performers, you hire somebody new into your team, they go into the office, they sit down with everybody else, they learn from them, they aspire to be like them, the bar is high, everybody's pulling each other higher and higher, and that doesn't really work that way, because everybody is sitting at their homes, behind their screens, or working asynchronously, and they spend most of the time on their own. And this is why we need to be intentional, and we can't just rely on osmosis happening. This starts with hiring the right people. That's something we've all heard. But also, again, tight feedback loops and clear expectations. The next insight here, the next lesson we've taken over the years is another one we've seen in the past, even though not exactly in this way, which is that everything that's worth doing needs a clear owner. And that owner needs feedback. They shouldn't be working alone. From very early on, we've embraced Apple's DRI concept, directly responsible individual. If you haven't heard about it, this means that every project we do has one specific person who is accountable for its success, for its failure, etc. We also embraced very strongly peer reviews, for reasons you probably can already guess from being in this room for the past few minutes with me. Everything we do, to ensure a high-quality bar, to ensure decisions are sound, to ensure knowledge is shared, we have peer reviews in multiple stages of the process. And not just code. Documentation, specs, ideas, projects, strategy, everything is reviewed by someone else. Ownership with feedback is a key element to maintaining high velocity while ensuring decision-making is sound and mentoring is happening in a fully distributed team. The last lesson we took, maybe not as intuitive, but I also want to share it with you, is about serendipity. You see, co-located teams get a lot of serendipity for free. There's the coffee machine, there's the water cooler, there's the weekly lunch, there's the soccer game, there's whatever you want to call it. Fully distributed teams get none of it. And the problem is, without serendipity, you lose a lot of important elements. You lose bonding, you lose creativity, you lose the possibility for random brainstorms. So we manufacture it. That's our approach. We were inspired by the past where, again, scientists and artists, if you look back, they used to gather around in the cities, not just to work, but also to hang out in pubs and so on. And this was a very important element of how they were thriving. And we do that via retreats. So we have, a yearly company retreat where we get everybody together in some city in the world. We also have a yearly team retreat where more specific teams get together in person. we don't just do these, we also invest in digital ways of bridging these gaps. We have monthly casual hangouts where random groups of people get together to talk about random topics. We have interest-based channels and discussions and initiatives and talks internally as well. And another point to manufacturing serendipity, and this is again one of my favorites, is something, I don't have a good name for it, so sorry about, there are 2 made-up names in this slide, but it's deliberate empathy. And this is basically, besides the usual expectations of people just being correct and nice to each other that we all uphold, we also try to incentivize it. So for example, all of our internal meetings, all of them start with this section, the check-in, red, yellow, green, which sets the mood for the people in the meeting, like how are they feeling about their work and their personal life. That's just the first step in every meeting. Another one we see in some team meetings is a specific section to celebrate. Even if you have nothing, it's always there, and you always have to go through this. Because in the end, loneliness is a problem, and group innovation is a challenge in distributed work, so we have to mitigate this. And this is just like a sample. There are many more things we learned, but they either are disconnected or not that insightful with the previous section. But we can start to see all of the same red threads as we were seeing before, which leads to the last section in this presentation, which connects all the dots and all the red threads, and this is more prescriptive. It's that blueprint that we were talking about. So let's talk about the strengths of remote work, of distributed work. And the first is deep work, and this is a strength because it can easily be the default. A way of working that invests heavily on deep work can easily be the default when everybody's sitting in their homes. And my advice to you is to embrace it. This means encouraging people to block large blocks of uninterrupted time. It means giving them space to do that. Don't give them a bunch of meetings to attend scattered around the week. Because ultimately, we should focus on clear goals and deliverables, not status updates or status meetings. The next one is flexibility. It's a strength of remote work by definition. It's a flexible work arrangement. This can also easily be the default. And I argue that we should embrace this too. Let people work when it's most convenient and most productive for them. Go over the hill of not focusing on presence and focusing on results. And it's an everybody wins type of situation. Autonomy is the next one on the list, but it's not just a strength, it's also a requirement, both autonomy and trust. And we should embrace these two, but we need to set them up for success, because autonomy without direction is anarchy. We have an important job to do on setting the direction, and by direction I mean, again, core values, mission, strategy, make those super clear, make those accessible, be very transparent, and if we do all of the things right and people have the right tools and the right knowledge to do the work, then yes, give them autonomy and trust for them to do whatever they need to do. One that is kind of a weakness if you take it at face value, but a strength when you look deeper is this one. Well, in distributed work, you can't really look at the inputs, what people are doing. You can only look at what they're delivering or the results that they are generating. So this is kind of a weakness because you don't have the whole spectrum. There's also some nuance here because you shouldn't really ignore inputs if you have junior people on your staff or if you're hiring somebody who's not used to your company or your way of working. You should help them and coach them on how they're approaching work so that they can generate the results that they want. But ultimately, this is a forcing function for you to focus on outcomes, which is, I argue, what you should hold your senior team and leadership team accountable for. Now on to weaknesses. It's not all roses, and silos, as you've probably already picked up, are a big weakness of distributed work. Silos happen naturally when there is no need or incentive to gather and to do things together. And this is very common when working in a distributed team. And when it comes to silos, I argue that we should actively refuse them, and we refuse them by having a documentation-first culture, as I mentioned before, and by investing in transparency, especially within the leadership team. Lack of mentoring is another weakness of distributed work. You can't just go into the office and sit around your teammates who have 10 more years in the industry as everybody else. You can't rely on that happening inside your company. So without side-by-side sitting, mentoring is less effective, but this is also something we can counter with proper processes and proper ideas, and in this case, I wrote peer reviews and collaboration based on what we've seen before, but the basic idea is that you need to manufacture these opportunities to collaborate and to mentor. They don't happen accidentally. The last weakness I want to mention in this blueprint is lack of serendipity. Again, we've been over this. This is just like a summary of these lessons, but there is almost no serendipity in a fully distributed company. So, you can refuse this too, and you can do something about it. You can create events, you can create other conditions for people to socialize, not only on a work level, but also a personal level. Now, there is a bonus element here. This is not mentioned in the rest of the presentation, but as I was looking at this map of insights and weaknesses and strengths, I noticed there was a concept that was cutting across everything else, which was intent. The key idea being that if we leave things to chance, they may work, but if we want them to work and we want to be sure that they work, we need to think about them and we need to do something about them. We need to design for them, and we are used to this in software. It's the exact same thing in our organizations. And this concludes the blueprint for the art of distributed work, but I do want to leave you with a parting thought. This is very focused on distributed and asynchronous work, but honestly, if you look at this list and you're managing an in-person team, I bet you can take more than half of these ideas and apply them to your team and get a lot of value out of it. Thank you.